afternoon and welcome to the Law&Crime Network. I'm Angelica Spanos. Thanks so much for joining us today. We have a big day here and a lot of things to get to. We brought you this verdict live yesterday when a jury found Wesley Mathews guilty and sentenced him to life in prison with parole. Wesley Mathews admitted to killing his 3-year-old adopted daughter, Sharon Mathews. But police say Mathews lied to them. He initially told police Sharon disappeared on October 7th in 2017 after he left her outside the family's home as punishment for not drinking her milk. Then, when her body was discovered 2 weeks later in a culvert, he changed his story and said that she choked to death while he was physically helping her drink her milk. Now, all this came as there was already allegations against Mathews and his wife for abusing and neglecting the adopted daughter. He was originally charged with capital murder, and if convicted, he would have faced life in prison without parole. But Mathews entered into a slow plea of injuring a child by omission, meaning that he is pleading guilty to a lesser charge, and a jury would have to decide that punishment. Let's look back at the verdict from the courtroom yesterday. That was the verdict. Joining us to talk about this and break this all down, Elura Nanos, our Law&Crime legal analyst. Thanks for being here with us today.
Thanks so much. Great to be here, Angelica.
So real quick, before we play more of his cross-examination and such, Wesley Mathews didn't get life in prison. What made the jury go, I guess, sort of easy on him in this instance where there was a child murdered?
Well, it sounds like from what we just watched, he did get life in prison, but there is a possibility of parole after 30 years. That's when he'll be eligible. So in this case, what we have here is kind of an unusual situation. We have a plea followed by a jury sentence. So normally in criminal law, when you see a plea bargain, what you have is a recommendation coming from the prosecutor as part of the agreement. The prosecutor says, we'll recommend a certain sentence to the judge, and in exchange, you will plead guilty. So this is sort of different. It kind of turns that entire equation on its head, because what you have is what's called a slow plea, where he admitted that he committed the crime. He admitted to not an intentional crime, but a crime of omission, and then the jury got to decide the verdict. Now, normally in a case like this, because it's a child death and the idea of guilt is not in question, the jury wasn't the one to decide whether he's guilty. He pleaded guilty. Really, what I would expect is the jury to do as much as they possibly could. So the question that we have now is, did the jury understand that he was going to be eligible for parole after 30 years? They did sentence him to quite a severe verdict because you're talking about life in prison. But I suppose it could have gone farther. And I have to wonder why. Perhaps because the jury wasn't there to hear that initial evidence on guilt. Perhaps because the jury didn't have a direct hand in that maybe the jury is sort of, easing back on it at this point.
All right. Well, we want to go ahead and look at him when he is under direct examination. This is from yesterday afternoon. Let's take a look. That's pretty terrible. We hear him kind of recounting exactly what happened, how she choked there. And really, he talked about his role in that moment when she presumably died at the time. Elura, when you're hearing this and he's on the stand saying this, is this basically an admission?
I think that whether it's an admission, it really depends on sort of what you're bringing to it. And I'll tell you, I'm watching that, and I was a former children's services prosecutor, and I look at that and I think this is totally an admission, because I'm hearing what this guy is saying, and what I'm getting from it is, maybe he didn't go in there premeditated, expecting and hoping that he would kill this child. But he knows exactly how it happened. He knows exactly why it happened. And he probably, was a serial child abuser and regularly was violent with this child and lost his patience and then killed her. And that's really what I'm hearing from this. He's minimizing it, obviously. But as someone who has heard people talk about incidents like this with children, I see this, and to me, it reads as an admission, even though that's not what he thinks he's doing.
Right. All right. Well, he goes on to say more, so let's look at that. This is interesting because now we hear basically that there was a cover-up type of situation going on here. He says that, you know, his efforts were failed. He confirms that, and he's being asked, why didn't you call someone? Why didn't you get help? Why didn't you do anything? So now we're kind of thinking, oh, he covered this up. Elura, when you hear that part, and going back with what you said before about he, you know, is basically an abusive father, what do you think when you hear this piece of it?
I think this isn't surprising at all. I think that this sounds like exactly what I would expect. This sounds to me like someone who, in anger, in rage, in habit, maybe, you know, he killed this child, and then once she died, he panicked. And first he panicked, and that, you know, perhaps he performed CPR, maybe, but certainly wasn't going to share it with somebody else, even, you know, the wife who was a nurse. And then once he decided that the CPR didn't work, he didn't really try to do anything, didn't call anybody, didn't yell, didn't scream, didn't go in to get anybody, and maybe panicked and thought about protecting himself far more than the reality of, you know, potentially trying to see if there was any way to resuscitate the child.
And going back, when we talk about this punishment, we spoke about this already, but, you know, he has eligibility for parole now, and this is supposed to happen after 30 years. Explain that and why that's allowed in Texas.
So that is the law in Texas for all of these kinds of verdicts, that although that there's a life imprisonment sentence, that there is still an eligibility for parole after 30 years. Now, the reasoning behind those kind of laws varies from state to state, but you know, essentially the reasoning can become that once somebody's in prison for decades and decades, you know, that's generally going to mean that we're talking about someone who's older. This man would be 69 before he's eligible for parole. That at some point that it might be better for the state and the prison system to really think about whether these people truly, you know, pose a danger to society and perhaps should be released. Now, whether the jury knows that that is going to happen is really unclear. There may be some jurors who just know that that is the state of the law in Texas. There may be others who don't know. I'm not sure whether or not anyone told them as part of this trial. But that certainly makes a difference, right? Because the jury pronounced a sentence of life in prison. Whether or not the jury knows that that might mean that he could get out at age 69 at this point is unclear.
So did they get instruction on that, or is that something that they would just find out later after the fact?
I'm not sure if they got instruction on that. So, you know, there's a couple possibilities. It's possible that the jurors, because they're in Texas, that they just know that that's how the law works. So you might have a few jurors that know that. I can't say whether or not they were instructed on that. I don't know enough about Texas procedure to know if they would always be instructed on that. So I can't speak to whether this jury specifically knows that and was instructed on it as part of this case. Even if they were not, there's always the possibility that someone on that jury knew that that was the case. I would imagine that somebody probably did know that. So, but regardless of whether the jurors knew or did not know that, there's nothing they can do about it because that's the law, and they gave him the maximum sentence that they could.
And do you think that this is an appropriate punishment for this?
Well, look, I think that there's really no appropriate punishment when it comes to someone who caused the death of a child. I don't think that there's anything that anyone could do, even including the death penalty, that really is going to make that right and really satisfy society when we're talking about the murder of a child. So do I think it's right? I don't think anything could ever be right. But I think in this case, it's highly predictable because you have a terrible crime and you have a really, really bad sentence. The worst sentence that could exist other than death.
All right, Elura Nanos, thank you so much. We have to take a break. Stay with us here on the Law and Crime Network. Plenty more when we come back.